Well, thank you so much for this warm welcome. I've tremendously enjoyed being here in Australia, and I would say 20 hours on the airplane is nothing compared to, how it is in Australia. I would have traveled 30 hours to be here. And thank you, Chris, for making this possible and your warm welcome. I have so much enjoyed giving this class, and it was a wonderful experience for me to work with you guys. Thank you. Is baby wearing something new, or is it old as mankind? Is baby wearing the most natural thing to do, or reserved for some freaks? Is it really good? How can I find the right baby wearing product? What are criteria that could help me? In my talk, I would like to look at baby wearing from different perspectives. I want to clarify the questions I've just raised, and in the end, I would like to find what I would call the essence of baby wearing. To do so, I've brought you some stories. Let me tell you the fascinating story of Dr. Fatweiss, of Dr. Kilkilionis. Let me tell you the story about this little leg that didn't need an operation after all. Let me talk about Birgit Kienzle-Müller, who called herself a baby-wearing Saulus and became a baby-wearing Paulus, meaning that she was really resistant to baby-wearing, and now she's my medical board of advisors. Let me also talk about this little guy with Down syndrome who tremendously got a lot out of baby-wearing, and so did his parents. And the really old guy, meaning from the old days, Dr. Floss, let me also tell his stories and why he collected more than 100 years ago many, many pictures about baby-wearing women and families. And let me also talk a bit about Margaret, you see down there, being over 17 years old, and she opened a baby-wearing store 3 years ago. So I've brought you a lot of interesting stories, and let me share them. Let me start talking about Ewart Fatweiss. He was born in the late 1920s. He is an orthopedic doctor, and he was the chief doctor of a hospital, and nearly all his life he studied about hip dysplasia, and that was the one thing he wanted to learn about, and he wanted to find good ways of helping families who are suffering from hip dysplasia. I had the honor of meeting him personally. He has 7 children, numberless grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He's my medical board of advisors as well. And unfortunately, his beautiful wife just died a few years ago. So that is something in his life now that makes him really sad. But he's really happy to still reach out and to give a lot of advices. And he has just recently wrote another article on why he is supporting baby wearing. Let me present you some of his material. In the early days, when there was no diagnostic for the hips, 3 or 4 out of 5,000 children at the age of 1, when they started to walk, they had a walk as if there would be a duck, a waddling git. Is that the right way to Thank you. That's the right way to pronounce it. They were limping on one or both sides of their legs. The reason was a dislocation of the hip, or a full luxation in the hip. Needless to say that these children were suffering tremendously. They were suffering pain, they were suffering, for being different, they were suffering for their whole life. They had many disadvantages in their life. Let me shortly explain what we are talking about. When the child is born, the hips are not fully developed yet. That means that the hip has not fully turned into bone yet, but part of the head and the socket are still cartilage. And so everything is really soft inside the hip, and which means that the ball can be dislocated inside the hip. And if worse comes to worse, then it can even fully be outside of, the ball can be fully outside of the socket. If the ossification is going too slow, then we speak about a dysplasia of the hip. And if the bone is completely leaving the socket, we speak about a full luxation. In 1895, a doctor named Adolf Lorenz, he found a treatment against luxation. He did put the ball back into the socket by widely spreading the legs into this 90-angle abduction, and it's called the frog position. And he put a cast around it. And first, that treatment looked very promising, but very soon after that, what happened, children were in tremendous pain, and they had developed, because of the wide abduction of the legs, they had developed a necrosis. And a pretty high percentage of the children was suffering from developing a full necrosis in their hip. So even though the results were not so good with the Lorenz position, for many, many years, that was still the position lots of doctors would use. And even in some of the English material, I've seen that even for today, people are talking about the risk of a too wide abduction. Let me just quote that. Numerous possible complications can occur with an excessive abduction, including redislocation, stiffness of the hip, infection, blood loss, and possible the most devastating, the necrosis of the femoral head. So that is a risk worldwide acknowledged now. So, but what to do? What could there be a better way? And Dr. Fettweis really took on this task of doing research in this area. And he once said to me that seeing these children with hip dysplasia and not knowing what to offer as a treatment was so deep in his heart that he literally went onto his knees and he really prayed for it. And he said, God, give me an idea what we can do and what we can offer for these children. And he went out and he did a lot of research himself, but as well he was looking at what type of material we already have in the world. He found a Japanese professor with the name Nagura, who had written in the 1940s already that the hip luxation was almost unknown in Japan. And Nagura has noticed that since the women are not carrying their children anymore, and that they are not crawling around in the house so much, that the number of hip luxation had gone up tremendously. In 1961 in Dresden, we had another big name, Dr. Büschelberger. And Dr. Büschelberger, he noticed the same thing. And he said, and this is a quote from his doctoral thesis, if all the children could be carried by their mothers on the hip or back, then hip dysplasia would not be a topic anymore. And that was in the early days. Dr. Büschelberger was also referring to research they had been doing in Korea, and that after in Korea the mothers had stopped baby-wearing the children, the number of hip dysplasia had gone up drastically. So that was what he found, and that really helped him to understand better how he could find a way dealing with hip dysplasia. And it all has to do with giving the hip a framework that the ossification can take place in a very good way. So what is it? It means that we need a special kind of pressure inside the hip, and that's a very, very even kind of pressure. And we have that type of pressure. Let me get you something. So picture this to be the head and the socket. So when the head is centered, completely centered deeply into the socket, then when it's neither going to the one or to the other side, then we have an even pressure, and that really helps with ossification. And they found out when that will take place, and that is when we have a squatting angle of 110, 120%, and a spreading angle from the middle of the body for 45 degree. Percent was wrong. So a squatting angle of 120, 110 degree, and an opening angle of 45 degree. And guess where we have that? On the mother's hip. Thank you to Ergo Baby that I could use these pictures, and thank you to Didymos that I could use these pictures. So because these pictures are really nice, they show the perfect position of the baby, and they show that especially on the hip, we have a great positioning of the baby. And you see, you just have to put a baby-wearing product around it. Dr. Büchelberger, who has found out about these degrees, he even developed in communist Germany a first ring sling, and I brought it with you. It's a real historic product. It looks a bit like a tablecloth from communist times, but actually it's a really cleverly made ring sling, and I hope you can see it, because you just put a ribbon around here and you have a ring sling. But I brought this to show you. I don't think they sold much. It wasn't very comfortable, but I showed you. I brought it to you to show that he felt so strongly about it that he even developed a product to hand out to his parents. And since it was a communist country, he couldn't produce it himself, right? He had to get the state of doing it, and the state did it. So Dr. Fettweis, he really broke with the dogma of putting the kids in a open loins position. And he said, okay, the way of dealing with hip dysplasia is really having them in a squatting position. That's what it is. It's not the opening of the legs, it's the squatting of the legs. So to bear that in mind, that's what's helping the hips to develop to the fullest. And this was, here we see a cast he has developed, and you see that he's imitating with this cast the squatting position. And here we have another product he's developed for treating children that are suffering from hip dysplasia. So Dr. Fettweis, he was the one that really developed, did research, and he developed something new, and he wrote medical history, and we owe him a lot. And I think his prayers were really answered. And this is what he'd say about baby wearing. He would say, just carry your child as often as you can, because it's so good for his hips. Let me introduce to you now Another great person you might have heard about, this is Evelyn Kirkel-Jonas. She has also, she was born in the 1950s, and also most of her life she has dedicated to doing research in baby wearing. She even founded a research group that's called die Forschungsgruppe Verhaltensbiologie. And they do a lot of research in the behavioral, to understand the behavioral patterns of the child. Evelyn Kirkel-Jonas has been fascinated with biology and anthropology, and she, I think all the studies since she entered university was dedicated to understanding the infant baby in the light of anatomy and physiology. Let me present some of her material. So at the core of all her studies, we find the old and somewhat philosophical question, who is man? And I very much also go by this question. I think it's in the core, it's in the heart of all the studies we're doing. Because only if we can answer this question, we have a good fundament for concluding what it is we should be offering our children. I think if we understand how the body is working, we can be offering a proper way of feeding, a proper food. If we understand how learning is taking place, we can come up with great programs that make teaching fun and very efficient. So, and if we understand how our little children, how they grow up and what their needs are, we can just help them to grow up to be really happy and healthy persons with great friends and a good social network. So that is something to really strive for. So who is man? Let us start with something obvious. We are all mammals. Our babies are, that's why we have breasts, that's why we have milk, that's why nursing makes so much sense. But let's take it a step further. Mammals fall into three categories. The first category is the follower, the second the hider, and the third one the parent clinger. Let's look at a typical picture of a follower. My second daughter, Anna, she loves horses, so I had to take some horses. So followers, they're miniature of the mother. They have full fur, they're ready to walk right after birth. Their eyes are open and their ears are open. And if our children would be followers, we would have a playground in hospital and we would walk home with our children. Clearly, we have a different picture after giving birth. So, a second group are the hiders. The hiders are born naked or with just very little fur on. Their eyes are closed and the ears are closed, so they're practically blind and deaf when they're closed. They're totally helpless. And first, people thought that our babies, our infants, belong into that group. But hiders can be alone for hours. Many, many hours they have to be without their mothers. So let us think twice. Is this really the group our children belong in? Not really. Our children are helpless and they are naked, yes. But also our children have their eyes open and they have their ears open. It's not so easy to leave them alone. So there's a third category of mammals, and that's the parent clinger. And as an honor to your beautiful country, we put the koala in there. I think it's a great picture. So the parent clingers, they have reflexes and the whole body oriented towards being carried. So we let's look at some pictures to make that. Do you see how the little ape is just raising up his legs. And he's raising, you know, his arms are ready to be carried. And actually, that's a wrong picture. An ape, to see an ape like that, something is wrong. The mother is missing here. And then we see the baby in just the same position. And I found that to be a very convincing picture. And also the baby is ready to be carried. Let me show you another picture. This is a famous picture series Dr. Kilkilionis did. And you might have seen it somewhere floating around in the internet. But you see that the baby is picked up by the father, and you see that he immediately goes into the spread squat position because he wants to be carried. And our babies are not just passive carriers, but they're actively involved in the process. The kangaroo is a passive carrier, but our babies are active carriers, so they help us to be carried. Also, you see the little foot. It's not just the hands that are ready to cling, but it's also the feet of the babies that are ready to, you know, find something to be to help with carrying. So let us reflect a bit what it is the different babies become really nervous about. When you picture a follower, he enjoys being with his mother, but because the mother, she is providing milk, she is providing that she will save him from any danger he might be in, so he has to stay close to his mother. And when the mother decides to, you know, walk away a few meters, he'll just follow her because he's a follower. But when something happens and the two get separated, and he does not see his mother anymore, he's in trouble because he doesn't know where to turn to. So he'll call for his mother. He is asking her to come. And these calls are pretty noisy. What about the hiders? The hiders, they don't just cry when they're hungry. Especially they're not crying when they're left behind. Because when a hider would start making these noises and the mother is not around, he'll become breakfast for someone else. So the hider, he starts to be really nervous when he's removed from the nest. That's the place where the mother will find him. That's the place where the mother will always feed him. That's the place where he will survive. So the hider, he doesn't know because his ears are closed and his eyes are closed. He doesn't know he's just 5 centimeters away from the nest. He could be 5 kilometers away from the nest. So he better let his mother know that something is wrong. Now, how about our carriers? What is it when they start to get really nervous? Ever heard a young mother say, as long as I carry him around, he's fine. The minute I put him down, he will start crying. Well, that's their way when they get nervous because they survive on our bodies. That's a place where we protect them. That's a place where they find milk. That's a place where life is possible. And apart from that place, life is really, they're endangered. So when our babies start crying, when we put them down, actually they're doing something really right. And they're not spoiled. No, they're very, very smart, beautiful babies that let us know, hey, mommy, I love you so much. Let me hang on, because for my dear life, you're the best I can get.